welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am Jessica. I will be your host today, and I'm looking forward to this chat today because our guest this is your debut novel, right?
It is.
But you've also written for TV.
I have.
Yes, you have. So please introduce yourself and tell us about your career and how it began, The End of Things, which is actually the name of your novel. So yeah.
That's right. My name is Sandra Chwialkowska, and yes, my debut novel is The Ends of Things. And it's sort of the elevator pitch of the novel is it's about a solo female traveler who goes missing from a luxury beach resort in the Bahamas. And then our heroine, named Laura, who's a fellow traveler, she becomes sort of obsessed with this missing woman and embroiled in the police investigation that unfolds. But as you mentioned, I am a TV writer by profession, and I have been for about 15 years. And so that sort of predates novel writing. I'd wanted to write novels since I was a kid. The TV thing happened first, so I went with it. And yeah, it's been a fascinating journey to see how in many ways the experiences are very similar, but in other ways, very, very different.
So before we talk a little bit just about where you got the idea for the book, because it is a really interesting idea, and I do have some friends who travel on their own. So it's certainly a thought that I've had, I don't want to be that overprotective friend, but sometimes when they go away on their own, I'm like, please come back. Check in. I become my mother, how she was all the time, and I'm just like, look, it's different when you're traveling with other people, right? But I do want to know about just how you ended up in TV first, because most of the time when we discuss books with authors, they're like, I want this to be adapted for television. I would love to be involved with television. And you're working in the opposite direction that they did. So how did you go from aspiring novel writer to TV writer and then finally make it back to writing a novel?
Right. That's a great question. And everyone's path is different. So when I was starting out, I was like, what is the journey? What is the path? I will do whatever it takes. And I'd always heard there is no one path. And it's frustratingly true. And so oftentimes it's luck and circumstance. For me, after I graduated from college, I moved out to Los Angeles. I thought if I worked for a screenwriter, it would somehow make me a writer, like being close to the craft. That's not true. I mean, I got an up close, behind the veil look at the life of the screenwriter, but ultimately I realized I have to just commit to the craft. And so I'm originally from Canada. So I moved back to Ottawa, where I grew up, and then to Toronto, which is sort of in Canada. Toronto and Vancouver are the two cities where the hubs of television writing and production. And I took a 6-month program called the Canadian Film Centre. There's a special program for television writing where, you write pilots and you write specs and you learn about the industry and the landscape. And through that program, I met my first agent. And then he started sending me out for job interviews. And I started my staffing career in Toronto there, where I worked for about 10 years. All the while, I was writing in my off time when I wasn't staffing in a room. When I was off, then I would, I'd write what they call now practice novels, right? Like manuscripts that don't sell. And then about 6 years ago, I made the move to Los Angeles right before the pandemic and for a job, and I was staffing in LA. And then the pandemic hit. And I can speak to where the idea for the novel came from, but I'd had this idea rattling around in my head for about a year. And I thought, if I get a break from TV rooms from writing rooms, I want to work on this. And so I made a, decision January 2020, I'm going to work on this idea until I have to go back into a room again. But then the pandemic hit and Hollywood went quiet. And so I just kept writing. And weirdly, it was that break, which turned into a year and a half, that I was able to complete the whole manuscript. So it's sort of this winding road for sure.
So the difference sort of between like writing a novel versus writing for television, I would imagine it is quite different. Did you want to talk a little bit about that before? Because I really am very curious, like I said, like about like where the idea for the book came from itself. And if some of these practice novels, because you are the first person I have ever interviewed, the first author I've ever interviewed who doesn't just say, I wrote a bunch of things that are still in the drawer that are talking about practice novels. This is new to me. So I would like to hear a little bit about that. But first, just talk about, writing for TV versus writing a novel, because I would imagine that is quite different.
It is. The primary difference is in a writer's room for a television show, you have a group of writers, right? Around 10 writers or so who are incredibly smart, incredibly creative problem solvers. Being in a writer's room is basically you're being paid to solve problems constantly, day in, day out for months. And so you collectively craft the season arc together in the room of let's say your season of television is 13 episodes. You're spending months breaking down story structure, talking in depth about character arcs, building out the tentpole turns of a season before you break apart to write your individual episodes. But then even then, when you have problems, story issues, plot holes, you bring it back to the room and you have a group of people who help you solve your problem. So it's very collaborative and there's this creative safety net, which is great. Novel writing, by contrast, is a very solitary pursuit. So you're lucky if you have one or two trusted friends or readers who you can bounce story ideas off of, who can read your work, who can give you constructive feedback before you would send it out to an agent or on submission. And so you're largely left alone to solve all those problems yourself. So that's the first very sort of major difference. But then it comes to just the craft itself. Like screenwriting, by definition, is about it's about what you see on the screen. So a screenplay, while it's predominantly dialogue, there's also stage direction. But the goal with the screenplay is to be concise. It's this art of concision. You're trying to convey as much information as possible with as few words as possible. The goal being that your eye moves down the page at the speed that you're watching the events unfold, like a minute per page. That's the goal. And by contrast, novel writing, you can be in the mind of your character for 50 pages, in just one long stream of consciousness thought. So it's much more about interiority. You don't have to be as concerned as the action and what your character is physically doing. And so for me, I love prose writing. Most television writers hate outlines. I love them. I love being able to write the prose part of the script first. And when I conceived of the idea, I was actually, like you, I have a lot of apprehension about traveling alone. I had always wanted to go to a fancy beach resort, somewhere beautiful, but I was anxious about it. And when I found myself in a relationship, I was like, we should go to one of these places. So we go, and it's a couples resort, and we get there, and there was among the couples, there was this one woman who was by herself. And I was so fascinated by her. Why would she come to this romantic couples resort alone? That I started sort of watching her movements at the resort, and I became weirdly jealous of the stranger who had this confidence to come to this place. And then I got kind of angry, maybe at myself, like, why don't I have this, chutzpah? And I had all these complicated emotions around a complete stranger that when I came home from the vacation, I had to unpack it. So I wrote a short story about it. And I thought, oh, this could make a good movie. And so I actually outlined a feature script. Um, and when I read it back to myself, I realized all my favorite parts of the outline were parts that would have to be cut from the screenplay. They were the internal thoughts, they were the observation, they were the insights. And so I realized, this needs to be another form. And because my heroine is a catastrophizer, she often imagines the worst case scenario. I needed access to those private thoughts. And so that's another difference with screenwriting is save, voiceover, you can't really access the interiority of characters the way you can in a novel. So those two reasons I realized I think this is a book. And so I had the idea for about a year while I was working other TV jobs, but it didn't leave me alone. It kept coming back. And that's when I realized I think I have to sit down and do this. But I didn't have, I hadn't done an MFA program. I didn't know how to approach the structure of something so long and so structurally different. And so the only, tools in my arsenal I had were how would I, if this were a season of television, how would I break this down? And I used those same skills because I just for lack of I had no other frame of reference. And so in television, when you start breaking down a season, you take index cards and you write down story beats and character beats. You mount them on a cork board or on a whiteboard. And then if you have a season of television that's 13 episodes long, then each episode gets its own column of beats. And I broke my novel into 13 chapters. And I similarly, each chapter got its own column of scenes. I knew I wanted to write a suspense. So every chapter ended on a cliffhanger. And I followed that similar arc of, building to this crisis, this low point for our character, this climax. So I used those similar skills in the structuring. Of course, the writing is different because you're writing predominantly prose and not dialogue. But structurally, it was weirdly similar.
When you do write dialogue for television versus a novel, did you find that it was harder to do it in a novel? I think, when you do like scenes between more than one person, banter or just having this ease of conversation is important. Now, when you're doing a script, you have, like you said, like stage directions, and the actors can portray certain things through their body language or their face or how they say things, expressiveness that depending on how you're writing, it would be a little bit more difficult to put together because you're reading the dialogue, you have to sort of frame it in a different way. How did that sort of work out for you? Did you find that extremely difficult, or did you also think that feel that your background really helped you there?
That's a great question. The background helped in the sense that I write a lot of dialogue for a living, but in screenplays, especially if you're writing two actors and you know the rhythms and moves, you try not to direct on the page. Actors really don't like that. They like to have the space and freedom to interpret the dialogue their own way. So I always try as much as possible, just put the words on the page and let them perform it and interpret the words as they see fit. And I also realize in screenwriting, you don't really have to direct action as much. You do some blocking in terms of where people are in a scene, but a lot of that the director comes in and it's his or her vision of how they see the actors moving through the space. So you really can focus on the words on the page and whatever subtext you want to imbue. But in the novel writing, you're the director as well as the writer, right? So you're moving everyone around. And I found that there was a lot of I was more conscious, maybe because of my background in screenwriting, of where people are in a physical space, maybe more so than the average novel writer who's not as aware, predominantly because when you're starting out, a lot of the notes you get from cast or director is, you have them come in here, but you want them to end up over here, but there's this how are we moving through this space? So I was just from muscle memory, I think I was way more aware of the physical setting and where my characters were in the imaginary world. And I think that's why people often say, oh, a screenwriter's writing is cinematic. I think it's because there's a technical aspect of being aware of where a camera is and where people are and that. And so that, I think that did just naturally filter through into the prose writing.
Yeah, no, I think that that makes a lot of sense. You know, you also talked a little bit about how when you're writing for TV, you're writing with a bunch of people and how novel writing is very solitary. Did you have people who you kind of bounced certain things off of when you got stuck? Did you use a beta reader at all, or did you just really kind of power through those knots yourself?
I did have one very close trusted reader who read every draft and, would untangle story problems and sometimes role play certain scenes for sure. I wouldn't have been able to do that without him. And then I did have a small group of close trusted readers with different backgrounds, male, female, when I finished the first draft before I sent it out for querying for an agent. And that was huge because you're so in your head, you become so myopic that you don't necessarily see the forest for the trees. So that was incredibly helpful. But no, a lot of it is you're on your own. But it was also incredibly freeing to write prose because so much of what I'm interested in as a writer is observation and insight and interiority, and these are the things that I feel like sort of starved in television writing. There's not a lot of outlet to express that, and the gift you get when you're writing for television or for film is the art of an actor being able to just add so much more to your writing, but they bring their own interiority. You can't really bring yours, and I really wanted that outlet, and so this was a gift to be able to do all that. But the challenge is you're largely on your own. So I was lucky to have one really good reader and then a few people to read the draft.
So I guess that also kind of brings me to when you did do the writing and you were picturing these scenes in your head, did you have, and you don't have to say who, but did you like cast actors in the roles of your characters? I know that often some of the writers I talk to will discuss, they'll be like, when I really wanted to imagine how this character would speak or what their body language would be, I was thinking of Robert Downey Jr. or whomever. Do you do mind casting? I suppose is a term that probably doesn't exist, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to do that just because having worked in television, you have these dream castings, and then there's so many obstacles and hurdles and availability and things fall through, so you try to keep it open. But here I had I didn't have specific actors in mind as opposed to an image of these actual characters who were sort of composites, and this woman who disappears, who's sort of this mysterious woman named Diana. I really wanted her to stay enigmatic for a really long time, so I tried not to put a concrete face on her, just to keep her even mysterious to me, for as much as possible. But if I had to cast it right now, I really like the main character Laura has a lot of anxiety, and I really like an actress like Anna Kendrick who is able to harness anxiety really well, and she's also quite a comedic actress, so I like her. And then for Diana, I mean, it could go so many different directions, and there's so many great actresses. Someone who kind of has this unapologetic confidence, but also enigmatic beauty and just presence. Someone like Florence Pugh. But again, there's so many great actresses out there. But those are just two names.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I'd watch that. So I guess my last question is, did you ever find out what was going on with the woman who was alone at the couples resort?
That's a great question. I was fascinated by her. 3 days into the trip, she kind of vanished, and I got nervous for her. I like you were saying earlier, I wanted to check in some way. And then I didn't see her again at the resort. And that's also kind of what motivated the mystery. Like, what happened if something bad happened to her? At the airport when I was leaving this tiny little airport in the Bahamas, she was actually ahead of me in line at the passport checkpoint. And I kind of looked over her shoulder and I saw her passport was from Switzerland. And I was like, okay, so she's this cool Swiss woman just traveling to the Bahamas by herself, just living her best life. So I think she was fine, but in my novel we go a different path in terms of her disappearing.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. The book comes out the beginning of January, I believe, or mid-January more so.
That's right, January 14th.
So check it out. The Ends of Things. The cover looks like a place that I would like to be on January 14th, which is on a beach.
Same here. Same here.
All right. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries. Turn the Page podcast. My guest was
Sandra Chwialkowska.
And we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.